Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateachershistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateachersfist, or shoot me an email, chris@ateachershistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, and welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining us today. Did you know that we will be spending this entire episode answering a bunch of your questions, so I'm not going to pose them to you now? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today you will learn all about random stuff in American history between the years of 1776 and 1812. Welcome to episode 101, Q&A number 2. All right, everyone, welcome into the Q&A. Number 2 is episode 101, and it is very exciting. We are now on our second group of 100 episodes, I guess. I was going to say second century, but that wouldn't really apply here. But episode 101. And we're just about to get started on the War of 1812. Our first Q&A actually came just before the American Revolution, so I feel like we're, just by happenstance, splitting them up pretty well. Welcome, Bill and Zach. Welcome back to the pod.
Always a pleasure to be here, Chris. And next time I will have a camera.
Yes, yeah. For all of you who are patrons, Zach does not have a camera on for the video recording, but... it's okay. Bill does, and that's who everybody pays to see.
Thank you, Chris.
That was more handsome.
Thank you.
Yes.
Also, I feel
welcome.
quite honored to be part of the second 100 episodes as well. You made it to 101, triple digits, Chris.
We did, and there's a lot more to learn in American history.
Small feat.
I've learned a lot along the way.
Congratulations.
Yes. And before we dive in, we have probably about a dozen different questions. We'll see how many we get to. From people who have emailed, tweeted, and put comments on the Facebook page, and we're looking forward to answering these questions. But before we get into that, I do want to make a pretty transparently blatant plea to you, the listener, for episode 101, if you are willing and able. If you could go to the Patreon page, patreon.com/ateachershistory, and donate $1 to the cause. That would really mean a lot. We're thinking that with episode 101, a $1 donation would go a long way and fall in line with the theme of this episode. And as jobs and continue to grow in responsibility and families continue to grow in actual living human beings, time is more of the essence, and whatever support you can give us for this podcast would be great. We'll have a live recording of this up on the Patreon page, and depending on our time constraints, we may be answering some extra questions for the patrons. What do you guys think about that?
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
All right.
Nothing
Cool.
like a little coercion.
Yes, so there you go. Thank you, Bill. So if you could make your way over to the Patreon page, and if you're willing and able to donate $1, that would really mean a lot to us, and join our growing community over there. So let's dive right into the questions here. Let's not waste too much time. And our first question begins with the founding fathers. It's sort of a two-part question, and I guess we can each take our time answering both parts of it. The first part is, who is your favorite founding father, and who is your least favorite founding father? Zach, do you want to take this question first?
Sure, I'll go first. So my personal favorite is Ben Franklin. And it's not just because the glasses, or the fact that he was an everyman, or the fact that the Decemberists did a great song from the music that was from the cutting room floor of the musical Hamilton about Ben Franklin. The reason why I personally really like Ben Franklin is he was always there at the critical moments for the political development of the Revolution and then the United States. Also, he was somebody who wasn't always mean to the Indians, and basically pre-7 Years' War, he even had talked about using the Iroquois Confederation as a example for cooperation between the colonies. And so that makes him somewhat progressive and interesting because the Indians often get a raw deal in U.S. history. But unlike other founding fathers like John Hancock or Sam Adams, who were there at the Declaration of Independence, but not there for the Constitutional Convention, Ben Franklin is really there the whole time, really kind of moving at those critical moments, moving towards what we think of as the founding of the country. So that's why he's my top pick.
I would also want to add, Zach, and in case you were wondering, I personally approve of that pick. I think it's a very good one. Not that I think you would really care, but I just thought you should know. Ben Franklin in 1754, something that we've talked about in a previous episode, you mentioned he was progressive. He also proposed the Albany Plan of Union. And there's a very famous poster, right? That poster of the snake that it says join or die. I'm sure you've seen it. If you Google it, you'll likely recognize it. Most people assume that was about the American Revolution, but it was not. It was just prior to the French and Indian War. And the Albany Plan of Union, Ben Franklin was calling for the colonies to join together. This is 22 years prior to the signing of the Declaration of Independence, and Benjamin Franklin was calling for like a union of the colonies. So he was really, in a lot of ways, one step ahead of everyone else.
Yeah, he was an abolitionist when he was in the Pennsylvania chamber, what we would think of as colonial chamber. He basically made an alliance between the Quakers and other immigrants against William Penn's son, who was a pretty bad governor, who, if people remember...
Thomas Penn, right?
Yes, yeah. He was... Ben Franklin was also the first American celebrity, kind of the idea of American nationalism, and which was nascent at the time. He was basically that ambassador to Europe. And so his time basically in Paris, really being critical in bringing the French government into support of the rebelling colonies, because there was a lot of political maneuvering that needed to happen. You know, he's kind of a playboy, which we can kind of look at as, you know, interesting or somewhat redeemable in this light. But overall, he's just kind of always there pushing the United States, or the nascent United States, in a good, positive direction for the most part, which is always nice when you're reading history.
Oh, 100%. So, Zach, your least favorite founding father?
My least favorite, I don't really have a least favorite, but I really hate the idea of the, quote, founders. It's often stated...
Why can't you just answer the question?
I'm trying to be different.
Okay.
Okay, so the reason why I don't like this is because there's this assumption that the founders were this monolithic group and they all agreed and they came down from Mount Sinai with, you know, the Declaration of Independence on one tablet and the Constitution on another tablet, and everything was set in stone, and we've only been failing them since then.
That's the assumption?
Yeah. Okay. I mean, that's how it's used in rhetoric, right? Yeah. You know, like, oh, the founders never would have wanted this. And
that's true.
You know,
okay.
When you read the histories, you're like, the founders disagreed about lots of things.
About everything.
And they disagreed all the time. And at one point in time, one group is going to be ascendant. And at another point in time, another group's going to be ascendant. So I just really don't like the concept of grouping them all together, almost like, you know, if anybody's ever watched Star Trek, like they're the Deep Space Nine founders who rule the Dominion and are a monolithic, you know, beings who should govern our lives and everything like that. I really don't like that.
Okay.
I will say...
Well, I still think it's a cop-out because I asked you your favorite founding father and you answered without hesitation, without going on this long monologue.
There are two people who are kind of jerks, and Alexander Hamilton and John Hancock were, you know, some of them.
Okay.
And... also, Thomas Jefferson, later in life, he pretty clearly comes out against freeing slaves. And this is something we can talk about later. There's a very famous series of letters between him and a young man who is, I can't remember his name off the top of my head. I will look it up here. But basically, in it, Thomas Jefferson's kind of like, yeah, but should we free them? And this young man who's very idealistic is like, no, absolutely we should. And that's depressing. So,
all right, there you go. So you hate the question, you disagree with the entire premise of it, but you aren't a huge fan of Alexander Hamilton, John Hancock, and have some issues with Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah, they're just, trying to be, yeah.
Okay.
We can just leave it like that.
Okay. So,
but this is going to be totally held against me if I ever try to run for office.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, most likely.
I'm done.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I think everything would be for the best if you choose not to do that. So,
okay.
Bill, favorite founding father and least favorite founding father.
So I am not going to equivocate in my selections. I'm coming with some hot takes.
Good job, Bill.
Well,
Bill's just like Zach being mealy mouth.
As much of a hot take as you can have when your favorite founding father is George Washington. I mean, it's
wow.
I know. It's pretty out there. It's a pretty out there statement. But if any of the listeners remember, Chris and I did a dedicated episode on Washington's farewell address after his second term in office. And I think I detailed, if you want to go back, I forget the episode number, but if you want to go back, I detailed, and Chris helped, but in small part.
Thanks, man.
In small part.
Appreciate that.
We went through pretty thoroughly on, the precedents that George Washington set, but also laying the groundwork for perhaps the moral standing of the office of the presidency, which I think is particularly prescient today. So I go George Washington. It was a little difficult because as Zach and Chris know, my affinity towards the musical Hamilton, an American musical, is so great that I almost went with Alexander Hamilton, but he was kind of a jerk. That being said,
by the way, real quick, Bill, Washington's Farewell is episode 85.
85. Go back and listen to 85. I got some good stuff in there.
Yeah, and Bill even said that I helped a little bit, so I appreciate that.
Least favorite, I'm rolling right into least favorite. Zach stole some of my thunder, but I think this one is easy. Not only is this person my least favorite, but I think he is the most overrated, and that is Thomas Jefferson. I think, and I know we're going to get into a bit more about the legacy in general, so I won't spend too much time here, but I think as you pour into his writings, as you pour into letters, not just his governmental writings, but his letters and correspondence, this guy was a plagiarizer through and through. Okay,
get out of here.
He
plagiarizer. Everyone was a plagiarizer.
Yeah, except he all of a sudden the history books only seem to cite to TJ for all of this, right?
That's not his fault.
Well, it is his fault because he made damn sure whose name was on all this stuff. So I think he is okay. Maybe a bit overrated should be the sentiment, but I think there are.
I think you're coming in a little strong.
There are extremely complicated aspects to how we remember him.
It's a very complicated legacy, and one that I think is oftentimes reduced in our society to far too simple of a picture.
Yeah, I should say.
Would that be fair?
I'll acknowledge.
I'm just trying to throw some. I'm trying to cool you off a little bit because you came in really hot. You got really worked up.
I'm going to temper myself again because I'm going to also acknowledge that my favorite founding father also has some complications in his past. Mr. Washington.
I was just about to bring up that hypocrisy.
Yeah. So I can't. Okay. I can't get off scot-free on my hot takes here. But those are my picks. Lock them in.
Okay, sounds good. So, Zach, your favorite founding father was Ben Franklin. You refused to answer the follow-up question out of a silly principle that you had trouble explaining, which I appreciate.
No, it wasn't that difficult. The concept of the founders as a monolith, that's what I most dislike when it comes to the founding fathers.
All right, deal. I just have a feeling Zach couldn't really choose who his least favorite was and was just like, you know what, I'm going with the whole monolith.
Like a good politician. filibuster. Change the question.
Bill chose a slaveholder as his favorite founding father, and then seemed to imply that his least favorite founding father may have been his least favorite because he was a slaveholder. So I'm interested in talking more about that in a few minutes.
I actually
Bill,
lean more
I would love to hear
heavily
your-
on the plagiarism aspect of his writings than anything else.
Okay, great, which everyone did at the time. But I'm sorry, someone has to stand up for TJ. I know Zach's not going to do it, so I figured I would. But we'll talk more about him in a few minutes. I won't take up too much time because the listeners have heard plenty from me over the last 3 years. But my favorite is John Adams. And not because he was the ideal, because he wasn't in any way. And I think that in a lot of ways that makes him endearing, at least to me. John Adams was a pretty insecure guy about a lot of things, right? When you're nicknamed his rotundity, it's not like he didn't hear that. He certainly did. He had an ego that could barely fit through the room. But in the end, John Adams was there from the very beginning, defending the soldiers in the Boston Massacre all the way through the Constitutional Conventions, through the Revolutionary War, through the Constitutional Conventions, during the Confederation Congress, served as the first vice president, served as president, kept us out of war with England, and throughout all of it, over the course of almost a 30 plus year career in one way or another in politics, he was incredibly steadfast in the basic principles of what he believed in. And what he believed in was independence and freedom and liberty. And he was an intellectual. He was one of the smartest guys in every room that he was in. Unfortunately, he would probably be the first one to tell you that. But he did not waver, even in the face of immense pressure. And I gained so much appreciation for him the more I studied his vice presidency, when he was sort of kicked to the curb for 8 years and given really no role in the government, which is pretty crazy considering just how involved he had been for the last 20 years. And then his presidency, when he did everything to keep us out of war, and he put country over party. And I think more than anything, that is what makes me really love John Adams, because putting party over country is one of the things I abhor the most in history and present day politics all over the world. I just think it's short-sighted and not a good idea. So John Adams is my favorite. I won't really go into too much detail with my least favorite. I'm just picking Alexander Hamilton because I really don't like him. I think he was brilliant. I've said so many great things about him in this podcast, all of which he deserved. That being said, he gave incredible contributions to this country. The founding of the National Bank, the report on manufacturers, the foundation he laid early in the government was invaluable. And I'm not discounting that. I'm just saying personally, I don't like him. And I think he was a jerk. And I also recognize that at times John Adams could be a jerk too. So I'm sort of doing like in the moment realization that both my favorite and least favorite share qualities, just like Bill did. But but John Adams is my favorite. Alexander Hamilton is my least favorite, not because of his contributions, but because he was just incredibly obnoxious and made John Adams' life extremely difficult. And since John Adams is my favorite, that makes me frustrated. So real quick, the third question here, and we won't go through all four of the first presidents, but someone asked, what is your favorite characteristic of each of the four presidents that we've covered so far? Because I don't want that. This is a U.S. history podcast. All three of us are Americans. We all love ourselves from America. I really liked this question because we all have so many great things to say about all of them. but because of the complicated histories, a lot of times we focus on their weaknesses, shortcomings, or retrospective analysis. So pick one president out of the first four, Washington, Adams, Jefferson, and Madison, and then pick out your favorite thing about that person. Who would like to go first?
I can go first. I think the thing that I most appreciate about George Washington was his sense of history and his sense of understanding that he was setting a precedent. So he really modeled himself after the Roman general Cincinnatus, who was a citizen who was called to the defense of the Roman Republic, fought, defended it, and then did not continue as dictator and went to his farm for a life of retirement. And George Washington was very much an individual who thought of himself in that manner. His weight was critical for getting the Constitutional Convention, for the Constitution to actually emerge out of the Constitutional Convention, just because he was the most popular man in the country after the Revolution, when the Articles of Confederation was our form of national government. And his sense of being able to take the history of being a student of history, identifying the characteristics and traits of a man who he thought was honorable, and then apply those to himself and his moment of history is what helps establish him as as the father of the nation. So overall, I find those characteristics very appealing, because that's one of the questions I think people would have for you, Chris, as a history teacher, or for just anyone who's interested in history, is why study it? And George Washington is the perfect example. He studied history of his day and drew the characteristics out of a great man or great men who he thought were important and applied them to his own life. And I think that's something that we should all take as we study history, because human beings are fallible. We will all make mistakes. We will all not rise to the occasion, but we can endeavor to do so. Kind of a bit preachy, but
yeah.
Anyways.
No, I like that. The American Cincinnati aspect really rings true to me also. I love that about Washington. I also think it's incredibly important for our leaders to be interested in learning and growing and putting themselves out there and making mistakes and owning up to those mistakes when they make them. I think those are the most critical qualities of any good leader. Not just in the moment, but then, as you look back on history, and leaders that don't do that certainly are not going to be remembered well. And Washington, deservedly so, is remembered well for those reasons. Bill, how about you?
So when I heard you read that question off, I immediately thought, I got to cheat a little bit. Now I'm Zach. I got to pick two of them, but they share.
Okay, I'll go with whoever's left.
I thought
then.
they shared a quality, Adams and Jefferson, that is, and that was their approach to religion and its place in the public square. Because I think because their writings were so prominent and it featured heavy use of terms like God or creator, or benevolent creator for that matter, that they are viewed in through a modern prism of being Christian or sharing a Judeo-Christian lineage, where when you dig a little deeper into it, and I think this informed certainly Jefferson's writings, and I think you'd agree Adams as well, that they saw this as more of a more of a deist or pantheistic way of looking at the world, that there is some creator out there that for whatever divine reason has enabled them to rise to prominence, has enabled this country to receive blessings, but the way they governed, I thought, didn't inform them when it came to infringing upon religious liberty, unless I'm misremembering something. But I thought those two in particular, because they shared so many letters back and forth about this, that those two and their approach to religion was what stood out to me the most.
All right, very good. I think that there's some real legitimacy to that statement and some value there. I think that the founding fathers really took the separation of church and state very seriously. And church and state at this time, especially in the colonial area, were so closely tied not just in the colonies, but then, of course, in England. It was critical for them to view that separation and to hold steadfast to it. And, anyone's personal religious beliefs aside, I think most can agree that it is good for the government not to get involved in that type of stuff.
And for the Facebook poster who claims I never said anything nice about Thomas Jefferson, I'd like the record to reflect that. I just did.
Okay. All right. Very good. Very good. Glad that didn't bother you.
Thank
you
you.
haven't been
Thank
thinking
you.
about it.
Not at
Bill.
all.
Yeah. I'll go with Madison. The thing I really like about James Madison, not only was he brilliant, and he really did a lot of Jefferson's dirty work. And that was one of the things that, Bill, you were mentioning your least favorite founding father was Jefferson. And of course I came to his defense because you were really coming strong. But one of the things that did frustrate me about Jefferson was his sort of tendency to have other people do his political dirty work, which I guess makes him a really good politician, but I just never really respected that very much. But as I study more about Madison's time as president and into the War of 1812, I really appreciate the growth that he's shown. Going back to the statement I made just a few moments ago about the best leaders being willing to try new things and to make mistakes and to grow and to learn and to evolve, Madison definitely did that from his time as Secretary of State to his time as president. He became far more decisive. He became more firm, and he became more independent and more independently powerful. And I appreciate that because the country needed that at the time. They needed a more powerful leader and not someone who was waiting for someone else to tell him what to do. And so I respect Madison a lot for that. Not only the fact that for the last 30 years prior to that, he had been helping to form our country, which is a pretty big deal too. All right, so question number 4. What are your thoughts on Thomas Jefferson's complicated legacy? Let's keep our responses fairly short here because we could do an entire episode on Jefferson's complicated legacy. But I assume that the person that sent this question was referencing his relationship with Sally Hemings, his really abhorrent dislike of slavery while owning slaves and never freeing them. Potentially his acts as president, where he really stripped down the national government, which, while it got rid of our debt for the most part, put us in a difficult spot. So what are your thoughts on Thomas Jefferson's complicated legacy? And Bill, I know you alluded to this earlier, so I'll let you begin.
Yeah, the two things that I'll say right off the bat. Part of my problem with Thomas Jefferson, and I think why I think he's so overhyped, is that he's seen, and to a degree rightfully so, but he's seen as this man of extreme principle. Jeffersonian is a way to describe people who have a strong political philosophy. And Thomas Jefferson, while attempting to strip down the national government, also doubled the size of the United States. The physical size of the United States. That's not exactly small government. So that's one. Number 2 is that I think we also remember Thomas Jefferson as this man of principle, and that the context of the time said, okay, maybe we can give him a pass on what was happening vis-a-vis slavery and his treatment of slaves. That being said, as president, his policies allowed slavery to spread, not contract. So I think that he is a politician first and foremost. He was talking out of both sides of his mouth. And when it came to principles, I believe expediency ruled the day for Thomas Jefferson, much like every other politician. So I think we put him up on a pedestal. Perhaps this is what Zach is kind of getting at about the monolith of the founders and how we do lionize these men. But those are the two things that I would say about his complicated legacy.
Gotcha. Zach?
Yeah, so the letter I had referenced earlier is it is a young man by the name of Edward Cole, August 25th, 1814. And this is something that's often brought up because Jefferson's writing is very clear about liberty, life, the pursuit of happiness. And when we get to the Civil War, kind of one of the concepts around the United States is that the Declaration of Independence is kind of, the thesis statement of what our grand experiment and government is going to be, that all men are created equal. And Abraham Lincoln kind of talks about how it's up to us to now live to that ideal, and that's kind of an idea that becomes pervasive in the U.S. polity. But basically, within this letter to Mr. Cole, who is actually trying to think about how to free the slaves, how to emancipate them, basically, Thomas Jefferson's an old man and just kind of goes, it's past my time. I can't really do this. He makes reference to himself as Priam, the old king of Troy, and how him trying to think of some way to emancipate these people would be the equivalent of Priam buckling the armor to young Hector to go fight Achilles. And you can kind of understand that. He was an old guy at the time. But at the same time, here was someone who had benefited from the wealth of enslaving human beings, had written about the evils of it, and that it should be basically blotted out. It's part of the Declaration, or was it part of the original drafts of the Declaration of Independence? Yet, when push comes to shove, as an old man, when really he should have as little consequence as possible for doing something like this, he just can't bring himself to do it. Given that and his relationship with Sally Hemings, who we should also mention, we have to give her agency. She was with him in Paris and decided to come back with him. And that is something that I remember.
There's a real relationship there.
Well, this is when I say trust that she has agency, and this is what a female historian, I can't remember her name, said. Because some people view this as love, but could this have been more of an arrangement because her children were all free, her family was, I believe her immediate relatives were freed. So then other people view that as, well, no, right, this is a bribe, you're being controlled. Yeah. You're basically paying for your freedom by giving up your body. Give her some agency. I mean, she was in Paris. She knew what was kind of going on. She didn't have to come back. But anyway, so that relationship we clearly look at now, and everybody, you can't see me, everybody's just kind of like, slaveholder, enslaved housekeeper, okay, I don't know if this is quite kosher. How should I feel about this? So I think that really is what brings out some of the bad feelings of his legacy. But the good news is, right, the material he wrote regarding the Declaration of Independence and those ideals are going to come back, and they're going to come back very strongly in 1865. They're a big theme in Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address.
Yep. Yeah, 100%. Bill, the one thing I want to push back on you, the idea of throwing out the Louisiana Purchase as some type of hypocrisy by Jefferson, I can't get on board with that, because Jefferson did not go into the presidency being like, you know what, I'm going to make the government smaller. Oh, and while I do that, I'm just going to stick it to everybody and double the size of the United States. That was not the intention nor the plan, and I do think he would have been stubbornly short-sighted if he had, if he had not done that. We could all be sitting here saying, and Thomas Jefferson was so damn stubborn and so short-sighted, he didn't even purchase the Louisiana Purchase because he wanted to stand firm to these political ideals he had in his head. So, and I see you shaking your head, man. You can shake all day long, good sir, but I can't get on. I can't get on board.
Thank God there was a fire sale, so he could get it at a good rate, so he wouldn't.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That's called good decision making.
Makes the best deals. Thomas Jefferson makes the best deals.
Yeah, yeah. I think Thomas Jefferson is an incredible person and an incredibly complicated and imperfect one at that. He is everything you would want out of a founding father at this time, in that he was obsessed with learning. He was obsessed with challenging his mind. While Bill calls him a plagiarizer, in my opinion, quite unfairly, what it shows is that Thomas Jefferson was incredibly well-read. He was prepared. He had a vision for the country, and when he became president, he was going to carry out that vision, and he took it as the people wanted his vision and he was going to carry it out. So much so that he refused to really participate with John Adams in John Adams' term as president. And he pretty much refused to make any compromises when the vote went between Jefferson and Burr for who would be president. Jefferson refused compromise because if he was going to be president, he was going to do it his way. And I respect that a lot. But I can't ignore the complicated legacy on slavery and what I feel fairly or unfairly to Thomas Jefferson is an abdication of his social and political responsibility. And I think, and it pains me to say it, but cowardice in a lot of ways. It is one thing to be one of the Southern congressmen or slaveholders who are incredibly bullheaded about the legitimacy of slavery, the necessity of slavery, and are so tied to it by finances and prejudice that they just never even own up to the fact that it's wrong and it's backwards. And obviously I'm not explaining that away, but it's one thing to be that guy. It's another thing to be Thomas Jefferson, who is wildly brilliant, is fully aware of how horrible slavery is, and writes about it constantly, and makes some half-ass attempts, excuse my French, to get rid of it, but never really does much of anything about it. All the while having a relationship, whatever that relationship is, which Zach alluded to, with one of his slaves. And then when that came out, denying it and saying he didn't, which of course just further dehumanizes Sally Hemings and creates even more of a social gap between, slave owners and slaves. And like I said, a far more complicated conversation. And I grew up loving Thomas Jefferson. For a lot of different reasons. And as I've learned more about him, I've appreciated his strengths even more and have been really disappointed by what I think are glaring weaknesses that he had that I'm not sure the other presidents that we've talked about so far had. And so I do think Jefferson's legacy is very complicated. I do not frown upon people who love him and think he's great because there are a lot of reasons to do so, but I don't think you can ignore some of the things that we've talked about here.
Can I ask a quick question?
You know what, Bill? What I always said in class is you can ask whatever
This
you
is more
want.
of like a editorial comment or a question about how we're handling something.
Okay.
Our official position is slavery was wrong, correct? We're not presenting, like, there are nuances to it, but like officially, like, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Okay. Wait, hold on 1 second. This is a serious question. Is what I said, did that imply or make you think anything other than that?
No, not at all. I thought
Okay.
it was a very
All right.
well said
Okay.
statement.
Okay.
My
well, thank you, good
No, I
sir.
thought it was very good.
Yeah.
But it did get me thinking. I was like, man, like, I wonder if some people are going to find our nuance to be like, because what you just said was very well said, but I don't know how everyone else is going to react.
No, and I think really what I was trying to say more than anything is I'm just so much more disappointed in.
Oh yeah, that
when
came
people
through. He should know better.
When
Yeah.
people have the intelligence and the self-awareness to understand that what they're doing is wrong and even horrible, and they don't do anything about it. Like, in my mind, that's so much more disappointing than people who are just so blind to the realities that they don't even realize it, or so insecure or threatened or scared that they never admit it. And that's the thing I think that disappoints me about Jefferson. Is, it's like he knew what he was doing was incredibly wrong. And he continued to do it, all the while having a relationship with one.
Yeah, it's just it was something that I don't think we had talked about as a. I mean, and it's big, like, obviously.
Yeah,
so, like,
and obviously we'll talk more and more about it in the next 30 to 40 years. Of
I just meant how
history.
we're going to approach it as a podcast. But
yes.
yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
Yes, the official stance of the teacher's history of the United States is that human bondage is wrong.
Because I feel like
You good?
I feel
All
like
right,
I could
you
come
feel
out
better
pretty strongly in favor of that stance. So I just didn't.
Yes,
I didn't want to get.
I think all three of us can. So yeah, slavery was wrong. It was horrible, and I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, we can cut all that out.
I think,
but
yeah, and no, leave it in. Leave it in. I want people to know that we officially think that slavery is wrong. So, all right, next question here. Question number 5. What was the hardest part about teaching this time period? And I assume this one is directed at me, not you guys. So I'll just take this one. I think that the hardest part about teaching this time period in general, and we sort of touched on it here with our answers, is getting students to understand the nuances and imperfections of our leaders. In the end, all of our leaders are human beings, and they're all going to make mistakes, and they're all going to do things that are embarrassing, potentially shameful, in retrospect, like really misguided. But getting them to understand and reflect and have a mature conversation about those shortcomings while not demonizing them as people and individuals was, I think, really difficult, because a lot of times everyone, for the sake of convenience and for the sake of mental clarity, like to reduce things down to just like the most simplest digestible concept possible. So, like the idea of Thomas Jefferson's a bad person because he had slaves. Washington's a bad person because he has slaves, right? John Adams is annoying because he was sort of an insecure egomaniac at times and drove everyone crazy. Like, I don't think those things are all things I heard, and none of them are fair. I hate anachronisms, which is basically taking a time period and applying it to another time period. And I think that people get lazy in doing that when we think about our founding fathers from 200 plus years ago. We just assume that if we grew up in that time period, we would have the same empathy, understanding, open-minded nature that we do today, especially about social issues. And I'm not totally sure if I grew up in a home in, Norfolk, Virginia, or in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, I would think any of the same things I think today. I don't know. So I was always very hesitant to go along with statements or questions that would imply such things. So I think that was the most difficult thing about teaching this time period, only because I dove into those social issues and those harder questions. It's something I would really get into, and it was really hard for a lot of students to grasp and to get an understanding of. Does that make sense to you guys?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always hard to get in the mindset of a different time. And that goes back to Bill's question, hey, is slavery wrong? And we can kind of fault for the fallacy of, well, some people had slaves. It's like, well, yeah, some of those people wrote about how it was wrong, and there were other people who said it was wrong, and there was actual debate at the time. Just because one side won the debate doesn't mean there weren't people there who thought that thing was wrong and shouldn't be done.
Yeah, and it's really hard. It's really hard, and I feel like we see that a lot in politics today. Like one stance here, one stance there, just labels that person as a bad person or an incompetent person, or you throw out whatever buzzwords that I'm not going to mention on this podcast, because then it would be distracting to what we're trying to do. But people do that, and they do it very quickly, and they come to conclusions very quickly, because it is so convenient for them to do so, and it is so validating of the things that they wanted to believe in the first place. And I think that's sort of a scary habit to get into, and that's something that people do today and would often do when I would teach this time period. Okay, question number 6. What was the favorite adult libation at this time? This was a question from Facebook, from Josiah. And Zak and Bill. What do you guys got?
Madeira. They loved Madeira. And in fact, if you really want to try it, there is a historical Madeira series that you can get that has a Boston and New York and a Charleston style Madeira. And I have tried all of them. And I think without a doubt, the New York one is the best.
Okay, and for those who don't know what you're talking about, because I totally know all types of things about booze, so it's definitely not me. But what would, if someone were to ask, Zach, what is Madeira?
Madeira is a fortified wine.
Okay.
It's similar to port. So it's kind of, you would not drink a lot of it. You would drink.
So if you don't know what port is, that would be
port is when you say a fortified wine, you make wine and you reduce it.
Okay.
Like
because when I think of fortified, I think of like building walls around a castle. So I was just a little confused.
Because it fortifies your spirit.
Okay, gotcha.
But basically, yes, the founding fathers loved Madeira. Madeira was for the gentleman class of the early United States, the Revolutionary period. They loved Madeira. Also, they just everybody drank all the time.
I could totally see you loving Madeira, Zach.
It is. I have tried it. It is a nice little nightcap that you can have if you need a little bit of alcohol, help you kind of go to sleep.
Okay.
That's a popular one.
For the record, we do not endorse the habit of drinking alcohol to help fall asleep on this podcast. That is not a healthy habit, nor a necessary one.
Agreed.
Just a nice bottle of Topo Chico sparkling water, right, Zach?
Oh, my new obsession.
Yeah, it's taking over the world.
It's spreading north from Texas.
Yeah, all these millennials and their sparkling water.
Technically Monterey, but whatever. Madeira is one. Another one is they really liked punch drinks. Rum was popular. If anybody is interested in studying a little bit about English history, there's a whole... I think 100 years prior to this, rum became a very popular drink, and there was a big movement around rum houses, and there was a social decadence, and et cetera,
you and I went to the Bacardi factory in Puerto Rico, learned all about it.
Yeah.
But of course,
but Madeira,
Zach, as
Madeira would have
history
been
goes,
the popular drink.
When the revolution started, rum went on the decline, and then whiskey went on the incline in the United States because of the the sugar embargoes and all that kind of stuff. So it's amazing how the dice fall.
Sure, that's a phrase I've never heard before, but I appreciate the attempt at.
Sorry,
amazing how the dice
I totally
fall.
cut
It
Zach
is
off.
amazing.
Please finish your thought, Zach.
Yeah. No. I mean, you.
Bill, do you have anything to add on this topic of favorite?
I do.
Glass of booze
I
at this time.
Yeah. So I am. I'm a huge bourbon fan, and so when I went,
the family or the drink?
Interesting question, but the drink for sure. The drink.
Okay. Okay.
So it's interesting. I found an article that was analyzing a book from 1884 titled "The Liquor Problem in All Ages," and it found it actually broke out by decade from 1790 the amount of alcohol consumption per capita in the United States by alcohol type, and the biggest jump in the period of time that we're talking about is in American distilled spirits. So when Zach says people drank all the time, he literally means like all hours of the day, like just all day long. It was set. The
other thing to remember is beer is not as alcoholic as it is today. You drink a lot of 1%, 2%, 0.5% beers, and it was a way to actually drink clean water.
Gotcha.
So it was kind of interesting, but yeah, I mean, these early Americans just were, I have to assume, constantly buzzed. But they were feeling good based on the amount of alcohol that was consumed on a daily basis.
Remember, they also all had like lice and bed bugs and other miserable maladies. So like, they needed something to keep them going.
That's a good point.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's really interesting. And we've talked about on this podcast, we've mentioned different like parties and celebrations, and like the amount of alcohol that was consumed is just mind boggling at these things. So they clearly had built up quite a tolerance to it. But one thing that we will cover more at some point in a future episode when we talk more about the westernization of Native American tribes and the eventual destruction and depletion of them, for the most part, was how big of an impact alcohol had on Native American tribes when the Americans introduced them to it, and how much the Americans really leveraged the psychological and physical addiction many Native Americans developed on alcohol with trade, because before the Americans came along, they'd never heard of alcohol and they never experienced it. And actually, it was really sad. A few years ago, I was studying, when I was getting my graduate degree, I was studying some different stuff on alcoholism in Native American, federal territories today, and just how high the rates of alcoholism are. And it's really sad what happened. And we mentioned that with Tecumseh and the Prophet a couple episodes ago. With the Prophet, one of the things he wanted the Native Americans to do was turn away from alcohol, because he realized how big of an impact negatively it was having on their people. So, in the end, to sum it up, Americans drank a lot. They liked Madeira, and they liked bourbon, and they liked whiskey, and they liked rum. And they drank a bunch of beer that was lower in percent. Didn't have these big craft beer IPAs like they have today. Is that a pretty good summation of it?
I'd say so.
Okay, cool. All right, question number 7, I think. And if I'm losing track, then let's pretend like it's question number 7. What is a topic during this time period-ish since our first Q&A that you would like to see a book written about?
Can I go first in this one, Chris?
Yes, you can.
Okay, so what
Bill, the look Bill gave me was that he has no idea, which makes me think maybe he didn't read the questions prior to this recording. So yes, Zach, you can go first.
Okay, I want to know about partisanship in the colonial period, specifically pre-revolution. So
why?
Because with the Constitutional Convention, Madison really comes out of it thinking that there won't be political parties. Lots of people don't think there'll be political parties, but instantly political parties form. And part of me just goes, they couldn't have possibly been that naive. Maybe they were really thinking that the ancient Roman senatorial idealist vision that they had was, these wise, learned, rich men debating the benefits of the state, also forgetting that in Roman history there was partisanship. They're mostly British citizens, so they understand that Britain has a parliament. There's parties within parliament. The English Civil War had a royalist versus a parliament factions even within the House of Lords. So, was there partisanship in the colonies? The colonies all had assemblies. How did that partisanship work? Was it mostly a relationship against the mother country and the royal governors versus individuals in the assembly? Since the Tories were basically kicked out of the country after the revolution, did people just assume that there was largely agreement on how the new nation should be governed? I want to know how they missed partisanship.
Gotcha.
Because it seems like, how could you be so naive to not realize that people would form political coalitions?
Yeah. No,
that's
makes
what I
sense.
want to know about.
For the record,
the book, send me a message. I want to read it.
If done up to your standards, I have a feeling that would be a very big book.
It doesn't have to be that big.
Okay. Bill, any thoughts on this one, or do you want to pass?
I'll just co-sign Zach's thoughts.
Good. For me, I think that I was disappointed. I've come to find from doing this podcast that there's a book on like everything, because I found them and bought them and read it. But one thing that I was hoping there would be a better book on, and I know this is so specific, and I understand why not, especially with the lack of resources, but I'm super intrigued by revolutionary Boston from the time of like the Boston Massacre to the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. Specifically, the Sons of Liberty. I was trying to look for some type of scholarship on the Sons of Liberty and like a detailed story of them and how they were born and who all the members were and all that. And I'm sure it's out there. I couldn't find it, but I would love someone to write a book about the development of all the different factions and the rising of the different political leaders and their influence in Boston in the pre-revolutionary period, and how all of those like social and political dynamics worked during that time. I like the city of Boston. I think revolutionary Boston is really cool. And so I would love to, and we've been to Boston, right? We did the walking to the Freedom Trail, and we did all that stuff, and that stuff was fascinating. Like, I would love someone to write a book about all those different people and all those different events. It really was the cradle of revolution. So it might be out there. If you're listening to this podcast and you're like, oh, well, duh, you need to read this book, then please reach out to me on Twitter or Facebook and let me know that, because I'd like to read that book. But if it doesn't exist, I would like someone to write it, and then you can let me know, and you'll sell at least one copy for sure. Right. All right. Last question for the podcast portion of the Q&A. And that, I feel like someone wrote this just for you, Bill, because they were afraid maybe you wouldn't have enough to talk about. And I'm glad they said it, because when we first planned out our series of episodes, I considered doing like a special episode just on the musical Hamilton, because you're so strangely obsessed with it. But then I thought maybe you'd like that too much, so I didn't want to give you that joy. But this question, which I think was aimed for you, was question number 8 or 9 or whatever number we're on. Why is or was the play Hamilton such a big hit? And Bill, I just won't even pretend like I have an answer to this that you wouldn't already talk about, so I'll just let you take
first.
This one.
I think Zach will also have thoughts here, because I know he's a fan.
Yeah, Zach will have thoughts. You guys both are big fans of the play.
So I'll say right out of the gate that the fact that you don't understand why this musical was so big puts you in the minority, Chris.
I did not say I did not understand it. I never said that. I'm allowing you to answer it because I know that you did a lot. You put a lot of thought into this answer, I'm sure.
I have. And so Let's start here. Let's start with the cultural impact of Hamilton. In 2009, Lin-Manuel Miranda came to the Obama White House for a celebration of American poetry, art, music. And
this video is awesome, by the way.
We'll post a link on in the show notes or something, Chris.
Yes, sure.
So,
yep. I'll put it up on Facebook.
He, as the story goes, he had finished Ron Chernov. Am I pronouncing his Chernow? Chernow's book, biography on Alexander Hamilton, and he had started working on a musical. And he had a particular spin on it that, when it was released 7 years later, took the country and ultimately literally the world by storm, as it now tours globally. He was going to write a hip-hop musical featuring one of the lesser-known founding fathers, the $10 founding father. So I didn't wrap that as well.
And that
Alexander
is
Hamilton.
Okay.
So please check that out. So from that point in time, and Lin-Manuel Miranda had done a previous musical that provided him some notoriety, but 2009 sort of launches this idea of Hamilton to a grander stage. I mean, you go to the Obama White House, something that Obama brought back after the W. Bush years, that particular American night of song and poetry and whatnot. You flash forward to when Hamilton was released, and the pieces of what made Hamilton so infectious to not just fans of musicals, because the traditional musical fan probably wasn't for an awakening with this particular musical. It didn't have the traditional types of songs that you would expect. It was light on ballads. It was, however, it fit the conventional structure of a musical. The I want, the I dream, the conflict, etc. It had all those elements. But I would say the two most notable differences when this show was released was the immediately apparent one, the fact that the cast was comprised of Black, Latino, and Asian cast members. Why is that noteworthy? Well, Alexander Hamilton and et al. Were not that. And so I'm not going to pretend to understand why that struck a nerve. I can guess. And I think we wanted to see something fresh and new, a different spin. Lin-Manuel Miranda has been quoted to say that if there was a Hamilton today, it would look like, or a group of founding fathers today would look like the stage of the musical Hamilton. It would look like that cast. The second component to why it sort of took the musical world by storm was simply the music. You had folks from Questlove to traditional musical folks just singing the praises of what Lin-Manuel Miranda was able to do with, let's face it, some songs were literally "How Does a Bill Become a Law?" And we all remember Schoolhouse Rock, but I don't think any of us would claim that Schoolhouse Rock is the work of a musical genius, whereas Lin-Manuel Miranda, the awards are like weighting him down. Like, you know, so those are the two, I think, most obvious observations as to why Hamilton took off the way that it did. I'll pause here to let Zach jump in if he has other thoughts about what I've just said.
Yeah, I think Hamilton also became popular because the full album dropped on NPR and Spotify, I believe. So NPR had a preview of the whole studio album. And I remember my sister, who happens to live in DC, basically texting me and being like, hey, have you listened to this? So it was one of these distribution events that only kind of happen in the internet, and especially in internet culture today. Something will occur and it'll burn really bright, and few of them have actually legs. I think part of why Hamilton had legs was because the story, not just the story of Hamilton and it was something new and different, but Lin-Manuel Miranda's personal story, the story of the show, that the fact of the matter is that it didn't have to be obsessed with the ethnic background or the skin tone of the actors. It was just like, hey, who cares? Just, you know, let's get good people. And then it has some really good songs in it. It has some really, really good songs from a show tune perspective. The fact that they basically reduce disagreements of the cabinet to rap battles, as a history nerd, it's just... I remember listening to it and being like, this is brilliant.
Yeah. It's really cool.
So clever. Of course, so to give haters corner, though, it got really annoying when people were like, oh, I'm going to send kids, you know, high school kids to go see Hamilton so they can learn about civic duty and this will solve the political disagreements of the time. And it was just like the naivete and arrogance of that was very frustrating. So for Haters Corner, it got really annoying how people thought that if we all just saw Hamilton, it'll solve our problems. That got really annoying.
Yeah, well, I would like to meet.
I don't remember hearing any of that. That's
yeah, but I'm sure there were some people. I do think that while Bill clearly implied that I know nothing about the musical, don't appreciate it, and am anti-Hamilton musical, it is not the case. I just don't know all the words to the entire soundtrack like Bill does, which I like to poke fun at him at times because he'll like randomly reference a song from the soundtrack and expect me to know like the third verse of it. And I have no idea, you know, because I have children and other things to be doing. But I think that the Hamilton musical is almost perfect in so many ways. It takes a story that not a lot of people knew about that was incredibly important to our history and makes it accessible and understandable, relatable, and approachable to 21st century Americans. Zach, you mentioned the rap battles from the cabinet, which are brilliant. Bill talked about the ethnicity and diversity of the cast, which I think is such a fresh take on all of it because it forces you in that moment to recognize that like, oh yeah, these were all white dudes, but America's different now. And it is really cool to be, as you're watching it, you're reminded, like, America is different now. We are a different country now. In a lot of ways for the better, one of them being the diversity that we have in our nation, which drives new ideas, which gets people out of comfort zones, which opens the hearts and minds of those who come into contact with people different than them, from a different background and who have different perspectives. And that stuff is so valuable. And that's one of the reasons why America is so great today. And I think the music from someone who played music, I have a huge affinity for music, and I know exactly how hard it is to write music because I tried and failed miserably. It's not easy, and the writing is incredible. I mean, it really is brilliant. This is not just a guy who, like, read a biography and then put together, like, he did soup to nuts everything, and he nailed all of it. And that's why it costs like $400 or $500 to get a ticket to go see Hamilton. And so those people that think that students can just go see it and cure all the world's problems, or they give them $500 first, because that's how much it'll cost.
When it was still strictly at the Richard Rodgers Theater in New York City, they would do a couple shows a week just for New York City public schools.
Which is awesome.
Do they think that they're changing the world just because they're letting some, these students see it? Maybe, maybe not. But if they reach 2 or 3 of those kids every show and maybe put them on a path of, service in some capacity to their local community, to a greater community, to a higher calling, then I think that sort of thing's worth it. I have not heard those sorts of calls that Zach was alluding to. Obviously that is
Zach has a tendency to just make things up, so we have to be very.
Oh no, this is like rich dudes, right? Rich dudes being like, "Oh, I saw this thing; it was so great." I mean, if anybody follows the political writer David Weigel from the Washington Post, he would make jokes about this from time to time.
Gotcha. I do think, but Bill, real quick, I do think there is value. We've all talked about the moment that we became really interested in history, if I recall correctly, because I have quite a memory. Bill, you mentioned something about your 8th grade. This is like in the first Q&A in episode 50. You mentioned something about like your 7th or 8th grade, Mr. Feely. Did I get that name right? Holy crap! I can't believe I remember that.
Pat
Mr.
Feely,
Feely,
my 8th grade, 7th and 8th grade civics and history teacher. Yeah,
your boy Pat Feely, right? He got you interested. Zach talked about a trip to Gettysburg. And I remember that because he complained about his mom getting coffee with all the actors from the movie and not like inviting him or something.
Seriously, she like had coffee with Martin Sheen and Jeff Daniels and just like, 7-year-old me.
You're totally
all you had to do
over
is invite me downstairs. No,
you're totally over it though, so it doesn't matter.
Nope,
but
not at all.
I do think, right, when we have memories like that, when we have experiences like that, things that open our minds to like, hey, there's something really cool about this story. There's something really interesting about this. There's something I can relate to here. There's something I can learn from. And those experiences are really important. I do think Hamilton is exposing millions of people to that. And I think that is awesome. And I also think because the music is so damn good, people learn the words and they sing it to themselves. And they sing it as they're listening in the car, or listening at the office, or listening, in their headphones when they're walking their dog or whatever it is. And they're learning about this stuff as they sing it, right? Because the words are describing what's happening. And it really is powerful. I've met former students that I had and coworkers I have now who know the musical and know the words to the songs, and now they know all about this different stuff and they're really into it. And then they buy biographies on Jefferson and they buy the Chernow biography and they read more about it and they listen to podcasts like this one, which opens their minds to more about American history. Because as we talked about in one of the first questions of this episode, one of the things that Zach loved about... Zach, it was you who said you love Washington?
Yeah, it was me.
Yep.
Yeah. Oh, that was Bill.
We both said it.
Yeah. Well, we both easy there, Zach. Easy. It's okay. We can all love Washington. But one of the things that we love about Washington was the fact that he did learn from people before him. The American Cincinnati. That was you, Zach. Very good. Bill's trying to take credit where credit's not due. Right, he knew, right? He learned. He knew the impact that Cincinnati had on the Roman people. He knew the impact that his abdication of power would have on setting a precedent in American history. That, and he didn't really want to be president anymore. But, that stuff's really important. And it's important to know this. If nothing else, it just expands your mind to other ideas and help give you an understanding of, why America is the way it is today, which is the entire purpose of this podcast. And I guess I'm wrapping up this sort of monologue that I'm having on the spot here about this podcast and how important this podcast is to me and how much I appreciate you guys being a part of it with me and all the listeners out there listening to it, to learn more about American history, to understand our politics today and our society today better. Because a lot of people understand what's messed up and what's great, but they don't know why. And if you don't know why, it's really hard to enact short and long-term changes to fix it. So hopefully that's something that over time this podcast can address. Bill, Zach, thank you so much for joining me for the Q&A number 2, episode 101. And once again, a humble request to you out there who listen to the podcast, like the podcast, download it, and look forward to it pretty much every week, right? If my and our schedules allow. If you could go over to patreon.com/ateachershistory and become a patron of the podcast for as little as $1, it would really mean a lot to me and to Bill and Zach, and it would help us continue this podcast as our lives become crazier and crazier. The research doesn't get any easier. So thank you so much for joining in. Any final words from either of you two guys? Nope. Okay. Very good. Bill, you look like you're about to say something. No. Okay. Okay, great. So thanks for joining me. Into episode 102, we kick off the War of 1812. Bill and Zach will be involved in the War of 1812 episodes with me. Maybe not all of them, but they'll definitely be involved. We've been looking forward to this. And so thanks for listening. And hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.